We ended that last lecture module by looking at 4 different examples of deductive inferences. And then we tried to use our native capacity to evaluate those deductive inferences. And I think now we're in a position to systematically relate what cognitive scientists have discovered about the effects of content and context on our native capacity, our system 1 capacity for formulating and evaluating deductive inferences. So we can do that by ranking them in terms of the level of difficulty, and we can think that that roughly corresponds not just to how difficult we find it, but also how likely we are to do it well. And so when we look at just content, what we discover is that arguments that have correct content, that is, content that mirrors the underlying structural relationships and illustrates the underlying structural relationships between the initial information and the conclusion or the transformed information, and that is content that we can evaluate. We know these are true statements, then this seems to follow and must be true as well. Those are the ones that we have the least difficulty with, where our content and our underlying structural relationships are pretty well manifest in the things that are salient to us at that native level, that is the content themselves and the relationships that the content draws to our attention. Once we get into arguments or inferences where the content is abstracted, like that argument that we had where all A's are B and so on, where there isn't actual content, there are just abstract characters that are placeholders for content, that is much more difficult for us because our native deductive capacity is really cued to content. It's highly contextualized. If we get rid of the content, it makes it more difficult for us to formulate and to evaluate those kinds of deductive inferences. Once we introduce nonsense words, that is, we introduce things that seem like content but that aren't, that actually is even harder for us. So the Terzich's your dogs example illustrates this point. Those nonsense words are soaking up cognitive resources. Our brain is trying to key on content that doesn't exist in order to help it to evaluate that argument, and the content isn't there, so they can't use it. And so these are more difficult for us to formulate and to evaluate. Finally, that last example is the one that we have the greatest difficulty with. And the difficulty here lies in the fact that the content and the underlying structural relationships that would preserve truth through the inferential transformation, those aren't aligned with one another, so that the content actually is misleading for us. And in this particular case, we didn't recognize that last argument as a good argument, precisely because the premises and the conclusion, the initial information and the thing that we were supposed to get out of the inferential transformation, none of those things seem to be true. And for that reason, people tend to judge that argument to be less good than they would judge an argument where the premises, the initial information is clearly judged to be true and the conclusion is clearly judged to be true, or the result of the inferential transformation. When we think about the relationship between content and context, that is, between not just the content itself, but the relationships that are presented to us, content that we're familiar with, that we can bring context to, that allows us to draw on information from our previous experiences, those are easier for us to deal with. So arguments about objects, properties, and events in the world with which we're familiar, those are easier for us to deal with than arguments where the content is unfamiliar. That is, they're dealing with things in the real world, but they're not things that we have a lot of familiarity with. We'll have a more difficult time with these arguments than we will with the ones that we can bring our contextual information from our past experiences to bear on. And finally, when we look at the information processing capacity, because even our system 1 deductive inference capacity relies upon, draws upon working memory. When we have arguments where the content is organized, it's a manageable amount, the complexity isn't overwhelming, those are arguments that we have less difficulty formulating and evaluating. But when we have arguments like those Lewis Carroll arguments, when we have inferences involving massive amounts of relationships that are not well organized and they're very complex relationships, the more disorganized the information, the more unmanageable it is in terms of both its size and its complexity, the greater the difficulty we'll have in formulating or evaluating arguments with that information. I'm going to end the module here with this relatively abstract graphical depiction of how content impacts, both in terms of its complexity and the amount of information, but also in terms of the relationship between content and underlying structure and content and context, how these things affect our native capacity to make deductive inferences. In the next lecture module, we'll go through a couple of examples from cognitive science of biases in our native deductive inference capacity that illustrate, again, these general relationships.